Hello dear viewers, this is George from Ireland, and in this video I'm going to be telling about the History GCSE course, International Relations from 1919 onwards. You can do it all the way up until the 1990s, but I'll stick to the interwar period. Anyway, so this course begins with the Paris Peace Treaties of 1919. The fighting of the First World War ended on the 11th of November 1918, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. So an armistice was signed between Germany on the one side and the Allied countries on the other. The Allied countries were France, the United States, the United Kingdom, Italy, Japan, there are many, many more. Remember, that was an age of empires. So France ruled many countries in Africa. The United Kingdom rules many African countries, quite a few Asian countries, such as India, Malaysia, Singapore, and so on. I won't list them all. Canada would have been considered part of the British Empire back then, things like that. So when the UK made peace, it meant the whole British Empire made peace. On the German side were the other Central Powers countries, the Ottoman Empire, which is a Middle Eastern empire based around Turkey and no longer exists. Austria-Hungary. Austria-Hungary was much bigger than modern Austria and Hungary. It was most of Central Europe. Bulgaria was another Central Powers country. So the armistice was signed, and that meant that fighting would cease whilst the countries decided what the long-term peace terms were going to be. There was a possibility that peace negotiations would break down and that the war would start again. It wouldn't be a new war, a continuation of the existing war. So the victorious allies, they met in Paris. Why did they choose Paris? Well, France had been the key battle zone in this war. France was one of the mightiest countries on the Allied side. And Paris had the facilities, big venues, palaces and hotels and so on, for the diplomats and politicians to meet. French had parity with English as an international language. So many Allied countries sent representatives to Paris for these peace treaties. They would include Belgium, Portugal, Romania, Greece. I could go on. So the Allies had to decide what peace terms to impose on the Central Powers countries. The Allies believed that they just won the war to end all wars. Many of them believed that they were creating permanent peace. It was perhaps naive, but it was the bloodiest conflict ever fought up until that time. So perhaps there was reason to believe that this must be a seminal moment in human history. They'd sometimes called it the Great War for Civilization, and emphasized they believed their cause was completely righteous and the other side were fighting for turpitude. Some countries had suffered horrifically, others not so severely. And the countries which hadn't suffered as badly were able to be a little bit calmer than the Central Powers. But the countries which had suffered very heavily indeed, such as France, were in a furious mood and were very eager to punish their former enemies. Imagine how you would feel if someone murdered a close relative of yours. You would probably feel irate. And because you were so extremely angry, you might well want that person to suffer. And in a sense, this is what millions of people on both sides in the war had been through, the violent death of a loved one. And therefore, they were enraged and wanted to make the other side suffer. Now, no, it's not murder, because one soldier killing another soldier in battle is not doing something that is a crime. They're not doing it because they personally dislike each other, but some of the emotions are still there. So many of the Allied countries blamed Germany for the war, and they wanted to make the Germans pay for the damage, reparations, related to the word repair all the harm they've done. So the Allies had the common aim of a long-lasting peace, but they differed about what peace terms they believed were most likely to achieve this goal. So the Big Four. The Big Four were the leaders of the four mightiest Allied countries. These leaders were Georges Clemenceau, Prime Minister of France, David Lloyd George, Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Vittorio Orlando, Prime Minister of Italy, and Woodrow Wilson, President of the United States. So they all met in Paris in January 1919. Go through the big four one by one. So I mentioned Clemenceau. He was the most vengeful of the big four. He'd had the nickname the Tiger, owing to his aggressive attitude, and it's not difficult to see why. France had been invaded by Germany in 1870, as well as then again in 1914. Germany had beaten France hands down in that 1870 war, and they'd made the French pay back the cost of the war, reparations. These were ruinously heavy reparations, and the German army had occupied France until France had coughed up. So many Frenchmen wanted to do this back to Germany. Clemenceau had been mayor of a district of Paris called Montmartre back in 1870, the Franco-Prussian War, and he'd seen the destruction wrought by German troops. Clemenceau, despite being married to his American former pupil, was vociferously anti-American, and he said that the United States is the only country which has gone from barbarism to decadence without the usual interval of civilization. He had kept his anti-American rantings to himself during the war because he was desperate to solicit support from the United States. But once the armistice was signed, he was freer to give vent to his views. France had suffered terribly in the war. 1.4 million people had been killed out of a population of about 35 million. Now, it might not seem very much. It's about 4% of the population. But of men, that's about 8% of the population. Of young men, it's higher than that. Males, about 8% of the population. Forget boys who are too young to fight. Or many of young males, it was about 35% of young men had been killed. A similar number of young men had been permanently disabled, like having a leg amputated, both arms blown off, blinded, deafened, psychological scars, driven totally insane, things like that. Having a broken back, people, teenagers who were put into wheelchairs and they were never going to be able to get out of them. So France had suffered twice the number of deaths that the United Kingdom had suffered, despite France having a considerably smaller population. A quarter of French soldiers had been killed. Remember, there were some young men who didn't have to fight for various reasons, were just medically unfit or had other vital roles in the war economy. So altogether, about half of French soldiers had been killed or permanently disabled. These men, sort of aged 18 to 30, were mostly frontline troops. The most economically productive sector of the population had suffered very severely indeed. So the French were seething with hatred, and they were determined to make Germany suffer. So as they detested Germany, they thought, we'll impose very heavy reparations on them and make sure they pay every last centime. France was $3 billion in debt to the United States. Now, this would be chump change to a modern government, but back in 1919, it was a mind-blowing sum of money. You can put 2 zeros on the end of that easily. Crucial battles have been fought on French soil, particularly northern France, and that was the most industrialized area of France, and so French industry had been decimated. So France was facing economic ruin. France did not want her borders threatened by Germany in the future, because of course she's a neighbour of Germany. They were determined to ensure that they would never, ever be invaded by Germany again. They believed the best way to prevent Germany threatening them was to punish Germany so severely, to enfeeble Germany so much that Germany would not pose any danger to them. So France must be paid back for the cost of the war. Germany's industrial equipment must be confiscated so she could not manufacture weapons afresh. Money and land must be taken away from France. Remember, Germany had taken Alsace-Lorraine away from France in 1871, when a peace treaty was signed about that war. They wanted to radically downsize the German military. France spoke of breaking up Germany into many tiny countries. Germany had not been one country officially until January 1871. That was well within living memory. So France had existed for 2 millennia in some form, as the Roman province of Gaul. So the French argued that Germany was not a proper country. And there was some logic to that the Germans had different identities, had been united by force. It was really Greater Prussia. Prussia's the area around Berlin. So if Germany was sundered into many small countries, then they would be easily dominated by France. France would be the mightiest country in Western Europe. Some of these minor German states might be French allies. The Germans might be busy fighting each other. France, at very least, wanted a buffer state in Western Germany that France could easily treat as a satellite. The French French Prime Minister was asked by President Wilson not to be so harsh on Germany. Clemenceau was very annoyed about that, and he felt contempt for America, saying it's very easy for President Wilson to be oh so Christian and forgiving, but he's not living next door to Germany, and he hasn't had his country so heavily devastated by Germany recently or in the past.